Hello! So, this is going to be a series focusing on the cut areas of Stalker that are featured, of course, in the Call of Chernobyl mod. And before I started, I wanted to put out a little intro explaining something. A lot of people like to ask what kind of mods are being used in these videos and things like that because, of course, people like to use these as a launchpad to make their own games, which I personally think is really cool, and I would like to be a helpful resource for that purpose. So what I've done is I have decided to use the description for this purpose. So I know that people don't always look at the description because it doesn't always necessarily have any particularly pertinent information. But in this case, I would recommend that you take a look at it. It has links to every mod that I'm currently using. There are about 15 of them. And they will, of course, lead you to the mod DB pages for each add-on. They have also been ordered. I've ordered them. And the order is the, oh my god, the mod load order for every one of them that I'm currently using on this playthrough. So that you don't have to worry about which order to actually load them in or to try and figure it out yourself. So from top to bottom, that is the order that I am currently loading these mods in from first to last. It's a mostly stable configuration. It's taken some tweaking, but I've kind of got it figured out now. With the no prefetch caching and all that, it seems to work fairly well. It does crash every now and then, but it seems mostly stable. Now, some of these mods are quite intensive. I have a pretty potent PC, and some of them you may not necessarily want to combine if you don't as well. So I've also put some links, or well, not some links, some little annotations, some little notes next to a couple of the descriptors down there talking about which ones have particularly hefty performance impacts, which ones are very RAM heavy that may cause some crashes to desktop for out of RAM issues and things like that, out of memory, depending on your personal setup, and so that if you maybe have a not-so-stellar computer or something like that, you may want to skip over those. So you can use the description of the video as a nice little resource for building your own Call of Chernobyl, I suppose, experience. At least, that's the idea. I hope it's a useful resource for someone, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. That particular description will be posted in all of the descriptions for these videos, so not just this one. And I suppose now on to our feature presentation. This is Dead City, as it was when it was cut from Shadow of Chernobyl. And this is how it looks now. As you can see, it's a little bit busier, a little bit more detailed, a little bit more cluttered, and a lot more finished. So, welcome to Dead City, everyone. It's good to be back. I decided to start with this one because it was just sort of in the front of my mind, and I actually made a bit of an error in one of my earlier videos on this game. Even though I knew better, I don't know why I even said what I did. Oh god, there's so many bullets. Maybe that's why. And what I mentioned was that Dead City was cut from Clear Sky, which of course isn't the case. That's not true at all. It was of course cut from the first game. Why did I say that? Well, I think one of the main reasons to me is that this game actually has this map actually has a fair bit of interesting design in it that reminds me a lot of Clear Sky. It's, of course, not featured in that game either. It was cut entirely and never put officially back into any of the games. But, oh my god, so many. But it did find a place, in my opinion, in the level design of Clear Sky. And that's actually kind of what I wanted to talk about this time, because I'm going to try and feature some interesting facts and things about each individual area. I don't want to just be like, hey, this is a place, it was cut, next video, because there's more to each area than that. Each one has its own story and things like that. Dead City's a bit of a weird one. It was never actually finished, as you can probably tell from that screenshot that you saw, and although just from that one screenshot it's hard to tell exactly how finished it really was at that stage, it's fairly clear that it was cut pretty early in development by the looks of it, because it's pretty bare bones. And although, you know, I'm not on the modding team, I have no idea how much work was actually put into actually restoring this map to a workable state. I have to imagine it was a fair amount. I would think that quite a bit of effort was needed to make it playable again. You know, a lot of this clutter and things that makes the map more exciting to venture through and more interesting to navigate, and also helps with the firefights and gives you more cover and things like that. None of that was there by the looks of it, and a lot of the stuff had to be put in, I imagine, by the people that were actually finishing up the mod themselves. And, I mean, was the map actually AI noted? Did it have pathing issues with NPCs and things like that? I don't know. I would imagine that a lot of that was unfinished. Oh, Lord. And it makes me wonder just how much was actually needed to be done to actually get this map going again. I'd like to know, like, you know, more specifically what was done to it. But anyway, back in Shadow of Chernobyl, what this map was going to be was an interesting little thing. A pretty hectic place that was important in the story. It was originally a... well, as you can probably tell here, it was mercs versus bandits, actually, were the main factions that were actually going to occupy this map. And you still see a lot of that here in the mod. Mostly, those are the factions that you'll see, but of course, depending on what happens, other factions can come in. You'll often see military, as is evident right now. And I've even seen duty come through as well, although that may have been after disabling the antenna, the giant brain, not the brain scorcher, but the brain in Yantar. And it was also connected to another cut map, one that I can't really do a video on because it doesn't exist anymore. It's actually rolled into another actually available map. It had connections when it was originally in the first game to army warehouses and to Yantar. But it also had connections to the swamp, what we now know as the Great Swamp from Clear Sky. But the swamp was originally going to be in the first game as well. It was pretty much the same map as it is now, just a little less detailed and not quite as finished at the time because it was brand new. But for the most part, it was the same thing. And that was actually going to be in the first game at the time. For those of you who don't know, the first Stalker was actually going to be a lot larger of a game at the time, and a lot more ambitious. And we'll go into some of that later on when we cover maps like Darkscape and things, when we go into entire mechanics that were cut along with the map. That one is actually pretty interesting. So, originally, your character, the marked one, was actually going to learn that he was Strelok here in this map, rather than in Agroprom where he learns it now. So it was going to be a very important part of the story, and was eventually going to lead you down to Pripyat, where you would eventually go to the end game. And this is actually a near end game area, because the mercs that were going to be here, the mercenary forces, were originally very well armed. Like, we're talking end game stuff like Siva suits and exosuits, or exoskeletons. They were highly well armed, and some of the very powerful end game weapons and things, like the SGIs, they were not easy to take down. And the bandit forces, although not as well armed as their counterparts and would often lose out in battles for this reason, still had a leader, a bandit leader that was very strong in his own right, and had one of the cut weapons as well. And in fact, the mercenary leader was also very strong. You would, in the story, have had to basically kill them both. The bandit leader to get a map of the area, and the mercenary leader to get something else. I don't remember what. I think it may have been a key, but I can't quite recall, to be honest. Now, I mentioned that this area reminds me a lot of Clear Sky, and that's why I made that sort of Freudian slip saying that it was cut from Clear Sky when it clearly isn't. And I'd like to talk about why, and why I think that's an interesting map, kind of a transitionary period for the developers, in my opinion at least. This is obviously not a fact. I think it's interesting because, really, every Stalker game has its own kind of flavor, its own flair to its level design. Shadow of Chernobyl is very claustrophobic. It has, in my opinion, the best atmosphere of any of the games. It's full of those decaying, rusted, dark hallways and corridors, lots of underground areas, lots of industrial areas, places like Dark Valley and Red Forest. Even though those have outdoor sections, they are still, most of the action takes place in like old industrial complexes and things that are very atmospheric. Call of Pripyat, the third game, however, takes place in incredibly wide open areas, and although there's still a fair amount of claustrophobia going on, there's, in some of the underground areas, especially by the time you get to Pripyat, a lot of the game takes place in much wider open spaces that are far more, well, just plain large, really. And the actual fighting takes place across much larger distances. In Shadow of Chernobyl, you would expect a fight in a village to actually take place within the houses of said village, taking cover behind whatever piece of petrified wood you can find. And in Call of Pripyat, you would expect a group of people in one village, a group of people in another village, and then a large space in between them, and the firefight actually happening between that large space, with each group hiding in their own respective villages taking cover. It's a completely different scale of combat. Clear Sky was between the two. Clear Sky was this interesting sort of hybrid, this transitionary period for the developers where they hadn't quite left the smaller scale fights and level design behind yet, but also hadn't quite, they hadn't committed to entirely large, open, well, really what Pripyat was an open world game. So it's kind of an awkward time for game design. And I think that's why, I believe that's the main reason why a lot of people find Clear Sky to be the worst of the games. I personally believe it's a really good game, and I think a lot of people still do. That's why I think a lot of people say the least good game rather than worst. But it suffers because of its level design, I feel, is the main reason. It's got some really good levels, in my opinion, but it's also got some kind of janky spots because of this kind of hybrid. It has fewer of the high points of either game, and a lot of the disadvantages of both because of its hybrid level design. However, all that being said, it does have some really cool areas. Lemansk is one of my favorite, and Lemansk Hospital, even though it's very small, from Clear Sky. And areas like that kind of embody what Clear Sky was to me, and that is what Dead City reminds me of. It is a wide open area in the middle, a very dangerous wide open area that you don't want to be in, because surrounding that area are lots of buildings that are very tall. Verticality is very important in Clear Sky. And if you are wandering through this middle vulnerable area and you're spotted, you will have about 678 people from every window in every building surrounding you just raining fire down on you, and you will have nowhere to go. That happened in Lemansk. It happens around the hospital too if you're down in that trench area. And it happens in some other areas too. And if I was to choose a mood for Clear Sky's level design, like I explained for all the others, that would be it. These kind of semi-urban, verticality-focused level design types of areas, and Dead City reminds me of that. So I'm almost wondering if Dead City wasn't kind of a, maybe like a after they scrapped it, they decided to go back to it later and said, you know, this is kind of how we want to design our future levels, let's go with this. And it was sort of their impetus to make levels like that. I almost wonder, I obviously have absolutely no proof of that, but I wonder if that's the case. That is really absurdly expensive to repair. Let's do it. Boop. So, what else is interesting about Dead City? I'm not going to do any story right now. Actually, you know what? Let's do it. All the buildings are very fun to go through, for sure. And there's quite a bit here to actually explore. Oh god. Another kind of strange thing about the... Oh no. Okay. About the earlier build of Dead City. It was different than was intended. The Dead City that I described with mercs versus bandits and things of that nature, that was not the original, although that was the original vision of what Dead City would be. That was actually not the first one that appeared in early builds, strangely enough. The earlier build of Shadow of Chernobyl that actually had this map in it, it instead was populated by a huge number of mutants. Just an absurd number of them. And there were stalkers in there as well, of various factions. I think a lot of loners were there, if I recall correctly, but just a tremendous amount of, like, every kind of mutant, aside from, like, pseudo-giants, basically. It was a bit weird that all that was in there, but they were. And that caused it to be a very active, very hectic, very strange map, because, I mean, you can imagine this map geometry with zombies and snorks and stuff everywhere hopping around. It was quite a firefight pretty much all the time. And here in Call of Chernobyl, the firefights are pretty constant as well, because as I mentioned, a lot of factions tend to move through here. Not only is there a constant, like, bandit, merc, and often military presence, but duty and stuff can roll through here as well. And there's also these, like, tunnels under here, which you can explore, which we'll do. Speaking of claustrophobic areas. Another thing about it, as far as I can tell, there was a theory that it eventually was repurposed to become Lemansk from Clear Sky, but that's actually not true. Now, this does happen in game development. This is actually a common thing where a piece of cut or unfinished content will show up again, finished or repurposed, later on in a sequel or spin-off if that company makes another game. You know, Dead Space did this. Visceral did it with, I think, some cut enemies and weapons from Dead Space for Dead Space 2, if I recall. And this happens for other stuff as well. It's just a common practice, because, I mean, you spent all that time and possibly money on models and textures and things and mapping and all this time, so why not use it for something later on, once you have the time to work on it more. But in the case of Dead City, that's not what actually happened. It didn't become Lemansk. Lemansk is its own place, with its own mapping and its own creation. It was not sort of built from the corpse of Dead City. And another thing, if you look on the Clear Sky PDA, you can actually see this. You can see Dead City on it. It's not marked or anything. You can't, like, hover over it and see, you know, Dead City like that. But it's there, right next to Lemansk, which is interesting. But, yeah, so that's Dead City. And for one more interesting little note, the area was actually, well, like a lot of areas in the fictional zone, was based off of an area in the real zone, the actual real-life zone of alienation or exclusion zone around the Chernobyl power plant. And from what I can tell, this place was called Poliska, or Poliske, or Poliska. I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce it. I do not speak Ukrainian or Russian. I am very sorry if I butchered that, but it's pronounced something like that, I'm sure. and it was a sort of Soviet-era block construction like this. The actual town itself had been there since like the 15th century, from what I can tell, but, oh god. But the town as it's known and appears with similarity to this one was, you know, a Soviet-era installation, very much like this. And it looks very similar. If you've actually seen pictures of the place, it looks a lot like Dead City. And as an interesting fact, as of 2017, or actually like late 2016, there are about 10 people still living in Poriska. Apparently, there is a phenomenon in the zone, the real-life zone, called self-settling, or self-settlers, usually senior citizens or older, more stubborn people that didn't want to leave their lifelong home when the 1986 disaster happened. They actually decided to stay. I didn't even know you could do that, but as it turns out, you can, and they did. And as of now, there are still people there, which is very strange to me. I just can't imagine. It's an abandoned city. They're not counted on any legal census. It's a city with crumbling towers and, you know, rusted out block buildings and things. But there are still people living there. Food for thought, I guess, because that is an interesting idea. I can't imagine doing that. But, yep, it's a real thing. So, this has been an overview of Dead City. I hope you enjoyed it, and next time we'll probably be taking a look at Darkscape. So look forward to that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.